Hi friends, welcome to my art studio. My name is Piya Samant. I'm a self-taught visual artist and I'm also an art curator based in Worcester. Born and raised in India, I now live and paint out of my studio in the beautiful, awe-inspiring New England region. I paint primarily with oils, but I also use gouache and charcoal for sketchbook practice. I'm a daily painter, and you can follow my art journey every day on social media as well as on my website. You can find the information here. Today, I will do a deep dive on the process of creating an oil painting. We will walk through the process from start to finish. Today's painting is a tropical seascape of the Napali Coast in the island of Kauai in Hawaii. Step 1 is determining light, medium, and dark values. We're going to accomplish that by creating a sketch in charcoal. Step 2 is to decide on a color scheme or a color palette for our painting. We're going to accomplish that by creating a gouache sketch. Step 3 is the most exciting part, where we talk about how to create the oil painting. And step 4, the final step, is where we talk about how to preserve the oil painting by putting layers of varnish on it and also how to frame it. So let's get started. Today we're painting the beautiful Napali Coast in Kauai in the island of Hawaii. This coast stretches for 17 miles and is home to many cliffs, waterfalls, and beautiful vistas. You may remember it from the Jurassic Park in the 90s. The Napali Coast makes a fantastic reference photo because your eye is drawn to several aspects of the landscape. There's the blue skies with the clouds, that's one of the beautiful aspects. There is the emerald ocean in different colors of green. And of course there's the pali, which is the cliffs. They have sharp edges and several different colors, purples, grays, and greens. It's a joy to paint them, and also it's a nice challenge to show the depth of the cliffs on the two-dimensional paper as well as on canvas. I'm demonstrating the step 1, which is creating a value sketch in a toned sketchbook. I'm using a Strathmore tan sketchbook for this exercise, and for drawing I used an HB pencil. In addition to that, I'm using white charcoal, which you currently see, black charcoal, and a blending stump. Also for erasing charcoal and creating highlights, I like to use a sharpened or pointed eraser. You can use either willow charcoal, which is loose, or compressed. In this demonstration, I'm using compressed charcoal that comes in a pencil form and is a little more sturdy when you put pressure on it, but you're welcome to use whatever you prefer. In the bottom of the drawing, you see I've created a legend where I'm going to fill in the values, the high key or the light charcoal, the medium, 2 mediums, and a dark, which is going to be black charcoal. I started by drawing a rectangle, and I used my pencil to kind of eyeball measurements for the cliffs and the clouds, and I marked the start and end points and created a very rough sketch in pencil. Then I marked the medium values using that HB pencil, and I did that off camera before I started recording. So that's what you saw when this video first started, was the medium value with pencil. Next, I went in with the white charcoal and marked all the really light values. So the clouds, the foam of the ocean where it hits the rocks, those are just the two very high key or light values in the painting. Something to remember when we do the value sketches is that when you see all the white, that's not all going to be the same color. They can in fact be 20 different colors or 3, as long as they have the same high key or the light value. You can have any colors, so the clouds could be purple or pink or white or shades of white, as long as they're all light value. That's what we're aiming for. Next up, I used black charcoal and marked all the really dark values. So these are shadows formed by the ridges in the mountain, the parts that are really dark lava rocks, and sometimes there are parts of the ocean that are really deep that show up as deep blue. So those would also be good candidates for the black charcoal or the dark values. So because these mountains, as you saw in the reference video, because they are covered in green, and that's due to the high rainfall in the island of Kauai, the mountains are covered with lush forests and grass. You'll see that a lot of this value sketch will be covered with the dark values, which when we go to the painting will be different shades of green and purples, and also some blacks from the lava rocks. Once the charcoal and the pencil shading is done, I use a blending stump. You can use pretty much anything. A lot of artists use their fingers or gloved fingers. You can also use face tissue, Kleenex, or Q-tips. Whatever works for you, whatever is the best solution would work. To blend in the charcoal, I try not to use my fingers directly because the skin already gets exposed to so many oil paints and art materials. So the blending stump works really well for me, and what I'm doing here is, because when we use charcoal there are very sharp edges, I'm kind of blending them in, putting some pressure using the blending stump, and also removing the excess charcoal while I'm doing that. Once you start blending, the stump has some charcoal in there, so if there are some dark medium values, I lay them down using the excess charcoal on the stump. So that's an extra step to blend, as well as to add more layers and values in on the sketch, especially the cliffs, because they have so many different levels of values. I mean, you can go anywhere from 3 to 10 values when you're doing the value sketch. But I use a toned sketchbook, so I typically use 4, and the way I do that is the white charcoal is 1, the black is another, pencil is a third, and the tan from the sketchbook is my 4th value. So I kind of experiment with that the tan from the sketchbook is where I take liberty and use the blending stump to add more values. So that's really it. There is no secret to creating value sketch. I know artists who use pencil and a black Sharpie. That's all they use to create these sketches. I think that they're typically faster, and they create strong contrast, but it's completely up to you. We're on to the next step of this process, and that is determining our color palette. For that, we're going to create a gouache sketch using colors that we see in the reference photo and also colors that we think may look good for the final oil painting. If you are not familiar with gouache, it is water-based paint, similar or closer more to watercolors than to acrylic. It is activated with water and it dries to the consistency of how watercolors dry. Acrylic, on the other hand, while it's activated by water and diluted in water, dries up to more of a plastic consistency and is waterproof. The difference between gouache, or the main difference between gouache and watercolors, is that you could use gouache transparent like watercolors, or you could build it up in layers where you started transparent and then create layers which are opaque. So you can go opaque on transparent or opaque on opaque. For this exercise, for the most part, I've painted it thick because I'm treating this as a color sketch rather than a full-blown painting. Since this sketch is created to decide what colors will go into the final painting, I like to squeeze more colors onto the palette than I'll need. So you saw me squeeze out a purple, some blues, greens, white, of course, yellow, again, that's an of course, and some reds. I ended up not using the purple at all, but just for the sake of ease, I added more colors to the palette than I needed. So the final palette of this painting is 3 or 4 shades of green. For the cliffs, some yellow ochre, the blues in the sky, and the blue-greens in the ocean. The most satisfying part of any gouache sketch is peeling off the tape. I think even more fun is getting to watch it. I hope you enjoyed this sketch. The third step of this process is creating an oil painting. For this video, I am painting on a 12 by 16 wood panel. I primed the surface with several coats of gesso and a final coat of acrylic paint to make it smooth. The acrylic paint you see I used was bright white, so before starting the underpainting, I coated the surface with a thin layer of burnt sienna and wiped it off with a regular kitchen towel or a paper towel. You can also use the blue shop towels that are available in stores like Home Depot. I created the underpainting to mimic the value sketch we created, and for this purpose I used yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and raw umber. It was a quick underpainting just as a guidepost when I start using color. Color mixing is an important part of oil painting. Because oil takes a while to dry, you can set up your color palette before you start the painting for the whole painting or for parts of it. I prefer picking different parts of the painting and mixing color for each part. After I create the palette for each part and I use it up, I clean up the palette and start over for the next section. For this painting, I mixed the blues for the sky first because the blue in the skies were more pure blues and there was no mix of greens or yellows in there. I also painted the skies next, and then once that section was complete, I started the color mixing for the ocean. The ocean has different shades of blues and greens, closer to teal. The final big shape to tackle for color mixing were the actual cliffs. This is a little more tricky because it is not different shades of a single color, like the blues for the sky and the greens for the ocean. The cliffs have several different colors. There's browns, purples, different shades of green depending on how the sun hits the cliffs and what kind of ridges are in there, how the vegetation is spread out. So I make several different colors for that. So as you can see, we finished the first coat of this painting and blocked in all the big shapes, values, and colors using the color we mixed in the past few minutes. To speed up drying time, sometimes there are mediums used with oil paints. For this particular painting, I used liquid. It is transparent and does not change the saturation or the chroma of the paints that it's mixed with. The liquid medium speeds up drying time significantly. I can typically work on the next coat a day or two after I put down the first coat. As you can see right now, I am adding a darker layer to the dark values, as in where I see the need for it. For the front of the cliffs or the cliffs closest to us, I am creating hard edges. Hard edges typically help us view the object as closer to the eye, and soft and blurred edges or disappearing edges typically make it look like the object is farther away from us. The second coat of paint or second layer of paint also serves as a time to correct some of the mistakes or add several details, which you'll see that I've added many details. I no longer am treating this as big blocks of paint. I'm going in and adding details while still trying to maintain the values of light mediums and darks wherever possible and needed. I'm allowing a couple of days between coats of paints that I'm applying to this painting. So by that I mean a couple of days of drying time while I work on other paintings. I tend to work at 3 or 4 oil paintings at once. I start by creating the sketch and the gouache study, and then I also draw on the panel, or I transfer, in some cases, transfer the drawing onto the panel from the sketch. And then I start applying the first coat to each of the 3, and then I keep switching 1, 2, 3 as the drying times or drying days go on. They're usually 1 or 2 days apart for when I work on them. So after a couple of weeks, I typically can have 3 or so paintings complete at the same time. Because we have switched from blocking big chunks of color to adding details, I have also switched brushes from a bigger brush to a smaller filbert. I also use rounds for very minute details. It really depends on what I'm currently painting. A little bit about brushes. I prefer synthetic brushes than animal hair brushes for ethical reasons, but also because they're really easy to clean and they're significantly cheaper, so I can cycle through more brushes. As the painting progresses and we add details, sometimes sticking to the basics and the original values starts getting tricky. So to avoid steering away from the values that we decided on and the values in the reference picture or your live reference, is to take a picture at different stages of the painting and on your phone or any other digital device, and tend to repeat this process until the painting is complete. Once the painting is complete, I do take pictures in black and white and compare with the value sketch and see if there are any changes needed or if I'm too far off from the values or even the color sketch. I'm going to continue to add details here, as you can see in the video, and adjust for values or any colors that I have missed. So I used a lot of dark grays and dark greens, and then for details at the end I'm adding a lot of purple. So one more thing I wanted to talk about is the type of oil paints. I highly recommend using artist grade oil paints if you have been painting for a little bit. The difference between student grade and artist grade oil paints is the saturation or the chroma. The colors are more vibrant, and I use M-Gram and Gamblin oil paints. This painting of Napali Coast in Kauai, Hawaii, is part of a series of 24 landscapes, seascapes, and floral paintings of tropical locations. You can see this painting and all the other paintings in this With Aloha collection of tropical paintings on my website, as well as on my social media, Instagram and Facebook, on the handle art.by.piali. The last two steps of this process are step 4 and step 5. Let's talk a bit about varnishing and framing. Once the painting is complete, I set it aside for a few days to dry. With oils, there are different levels of drying, and drying time can vary from a month to a year depending on how many layers are on there, whether or not you used a fast drying medium with your oils, etc., etc. So I typically wait not just for the surface of the oil painting to dry, but the several layers underneath. This really tests our patience as artists, but it's worth the wait. Once the painting is completely dry though, it's time to protect the oils, especially the top layers, by applying coats of varnish or sealant. So the brand that I prefer and have used for decades is Gamblin. Gamblin gloss varnish is typically what I like to use. There is also a satin version that I sometimes use for portraiture when I don't want a lot of light reflected off of people's faces. But for landscapes, I prefer, my go-to is gloss varnish by Gamblin. I use a big flat brush and I pour some of the varnish in an open-faced utensil like a plate, and then dip the brush both sides and apply thin coats of the varnish on the surface. I typically wait a few hours between different coats of the varnish to ensure that the previous coat has dried to touch, so it's not sticky anymore. I don't usually put more than 3 coats, but it can really depend on the painting. For the painting we're looking at right now, there is a lot of texture, so sometimes it may require more varnish in certain parts of the painting. Installation of the painting. You can install a panel directly on the wall by gluing an installation hanger in the back, but a better way to protect the edges of the painting and also to give it a museum or a gallery look is to use a frame. For oil paintings, I typically use open back frames, also known as plein air framing or plein air frames commercially. You can buy these frames at local framers or custom order them at a local framers. You can also buy them online or in art supply stores. Jerry's, Artorama, and Blick are good places to find the planner frames. My frame that you'll see later in this video is custom made by a local woodworker. Once I had the frame made, I primed it with black, and once the primer was dry, I applied glossy acrylic paint to the edges. I also use a gold rub for the inside of the frame. It gives it a special trim, as you can see in the video. And it's done. Thank you so much for joining me today as we walked through the process of how to create a painting. We talked about how to determine values, the light, mediums, and darks, how to select a color palette, and create a gouache sketch, and then we finally dived down into an oil painting, varnished it, and then framed it. I hope you enjoyed this session. Once again, this is Piya Samant from my studio. Happy creating and namaste.